Good afternoon, everybody. I won't dance. Wasn't that incredible? It was just an incredible start to this. My name's Alan Stewart. I'm currently the Department Chair of English and Comparative Literature, and it's my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of that department to Agents of Change, the Symposium, in honor of our colleague and our friend, Marcellus Blount. Marcellus had several homes at Columbia, but the Department of English and Comparative Literature welcomed him for the longest, just not long enough. Marcellus was only 24 when he interviewed for an assistant professorship in African American literature here, a post he took up in 1985. For over 30 years, he offered courses on African American literature in our department, through the 19th and 20th centuries right up to the present day. But he also developed deep interests in poetry and poetics with his course Poetic Encounters, and in sexuality and masculinity with his courses on race and sexuality, black masculinities, and race and masculinity in American cinema. Throughout those 3 decades, he remained one of our most popular and inspiring teachers, especially of undergraduate students, as I'm sure we'll hear today. His passion for teaching never left him. The last time I spoke with Marcellus, I discover, was on Valentine's Day 2018. He was on a leave of absence and badly missing his students. He wanted to meet to discuss the courses he might teach in the coming year, 2018-19. He was concerned that lecturing might be too onerous for him, but he was still excited to offer seminar courses, and he had a new one planned on HIV/AIDS and its representations for fall 2018. But it was not to be. In the last semester he taught, in fall 2017, Marcellus spoke about his planned memoir. Its title came from a song from Stephen Sondheim and James Goldman's musical Follies, which he showed us as performed by Miss Eartha Kitt. Good times and bum times, I've seen them all, and my dear, I'm still here. Plush velvet sometimes just pretzels and beer, but I'm here. Marcellus had more than his fair share of good times and bum times, and it's difficult for many of us now to accept that despite all his positive energy, despite his will to live, despite Eartha Kitt, Marcellus is not here. But this afternoon, he is still here because all of you are here. Thank you for being here for Marcellus, and enjoy this wonderful symposium in his honor.
We have the picture right here. That's so sweet. So thank you to Maya Tolstoy and Eli Hassama and to the Committee on Equity and Diversity for putting together this lovely program, for your wonderful, beautiful words earlier. Thank you to Lloyd Knight for that unbelievable performance that I think will stay with all of us for the rest of our day and on through our week. And to all of you for coming today to celebrate Marcellus Blount's life and his years at Columbia. My name is Sara Cole, and I'm the Dean of Humanities and a colleague of Marcellus's in the Department of English and Comparative Literature. So it's a special joy to be able to help welcome you all today, though a joy, of course, marked by sadness and loss. Marcellus was a kind, genuine person. I thought it was interesting, Maya, that that word kind came up so many times. It's in my little welcome a few times, too. He was a kind, genuine person, funny and witty, and with his own piercing intelligence. Some of the pictures we have been shown, including the one that's up right now, really capture him so well, that sweet smile, always, though, for me, with a reminder of some lurking irony, something arch and clever on his mind. I remember the day when I met Marcellus. It would be hard to forget, since it was at my job talk, just about exactly 20 years ago, winter of 1999, and Marcellus raised his hands early on in the Q&A to ask me a question. He began by making some very generous and warm comments, noting that we'd both graduated from Williams College, a place he loved, as did I. So that was very sweet of him. And then he proceeded to ask me the hardest question I've ever been asked in a job talk or maybe any talk. In case you're wondering what it was, can you please define gender? Which I couldn't then, and I still can't. Anyway, that was so like Marcellus. his kindness, his way of finding something to share in common, his humor, but also, don't be fooled, his high standards and rigorous thinking. It's been nearly a year since Marcellus's death, and I know many people here remain as filled with grief as they were at his funeral, an exceptionally moving outpouring of love and memory, with so many people thinking about him, his life, what mattered to him, and about what kind of person he was as a teacher, a scholar, a friend, a companion, an intellect. We now have this beautiful booklet with tributes from many colleagues and students whom Marcellus moved over his nearly 35 years at Columbia. Our panelists today will speak about his accomplishments as a scholar and about what he gave to Columbia over his long career. For me, in helping to welcome you all to this celebratory symposium, I wish mostly just to recall him, our friend and colleague. In the last year of his life, after he'd recovered from a very terrifying medical ordeal, he was fond of saying that he had come back from the dead, that he was living a second life. And so it's in that frame of mind that I wish to remember him today with such optimism and spirit. Elie Hassama suggested in setting us all up for these remarks, suggested that I might wish to talk about Marcellus's love of poetry. And this was a fierce and deeply personal part of his intellectual life. I think that will likely come up later in the day. So let me mention instead that his feelings for poetry were part of a larger attachment to fine and beautiful things, such as, for instance, clothes. Marcellus loved clothes. I will admit this was a bond. He was not flashy. He went for elegant styles with gorgeous colors and beautiful fabrics. He would at times, I'm sorry, I probably shouldn't say this here, but slightly despair of academics and clothes. So few seemed to relish a beautiful fabric like he did. He used to wave me into his office, and I would think we were going to talk about something serious, but mostly he wanted to show me a shirt he was wearing or comment on something of mine. From there, it was a short step to the Yankees, very short, or to opera, or to some fabulous Italian restaurant. Marcellus liked to live, and he was so alive. I was not exceptionally close to him, not compared to some of the members of this group today, and some of whom will be speaking, but he took me into his warm world of liking, of what gave him pleasure, and I could not have asked for more than that. Well, it's not my job to eulogize, but rather to help welcome you and to say, as Dean of Humanities, how much it has meant to Columbia to have Marcellus here for over 3 decades, a pioneer and activist who was never one to grandstand or to promote himself. Marcellus was a beautiful soul and a cherished member of our faculty who gave his time, energy, and deep goodness to this institution in its many forms. And it's therefore my very distinct and great pleasure to welcome next one of his dearest friends and the chair of our first panel, Farah Jasmine Griffin, the William B. Ransford Professor of English and Comparative Literature and of African American and African Diaspora Studies. She's also chair of this brand new department, whose founding we also celebrate today. Farah Griffin herself warrants a very warm welcome from us for her incredible stewardship of the Institute for Research in African American Studies and her leadership in bringing this new department into being. Farah Griffin has been an utterly invaluable member of our Columbia community since she arrived here nearly 20 years ago. I was thinking she just got here a few years ago, but it turns out to be almost 20 years. She's a great teacher whose students revere her and a central presence in our community in so many aspects. An important scholar of African American literature and culture, Farah is the author of 4 books and of numerous articles. She's an editor or co-editor of several volumes. She's won prestigious awards for her work, including a stint at the New York Public Library's Cullman Center for Artists and Writers, Scholars and Writers, and she's a national voice in African American, jazz, and women's studies. Farah is also someone whose grace, warmth, immense intelligence, and generosity have been great gifts to all of us who have known and worked with her over the years. So please join me in thanking as well as welcoming Farah Griffin.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here to celebrate Marcellus. And every time I hear something, it sparks another memory, and so I'll share one with you that I haven't shared. I don't think I've ever shared in public, but in all the years that I knew Marcellus, when I wasn't dating someone or married, he was my Valentine's date. He would always call me and he'd give me roses, and he'd make reservations at some fancy restaurant, and he just was the perfect date. He set a very high standard, so which is why I had more ex-boyfriends than anything else. But you know, and he did that in such a gracious and loving way among the many things he did. And I know, you know, he always made me feel like I was his only Valentine's date, but I always knew that that wasn't true because our dates would end very early. So anyway. This wonderful event, I want to thank Ellie Hissama for all of her work and her creativity and her imagination and just the love that she has put into this. She puts us all to shame, actually. She sent me something to read, to review, and I said, oh, it's perfect. And then she sent me her corrections, and there were like pages and pages and pages of corrections for those. I also want to thank Kristen Barnes and Orion Morris and Worrell, who helped edit this beautiful program book. Everyone has just given so much to this event, so thank you all for that. The first panel that we have is made up of a colleague and students of Marcellus's. I'll read you their biographies here, and they've been asked to present papers about their own work in conversation with Marcellus. So our first presenter, and I'll ask them to come join me up here, is George Amwat, who is a postdoctoral research associate in the Shelby Cullum Davis Center for Historical Studies and History Department at Princeton University. He earned his PhD in U.S. history from Columbia University. His dissertation, Strange Bedfellows, Public Health and Welfare Politics in the United States, 1965 to 2000, examines the political economy of Medicaid and hospital provision in New York City. His present research includes study of the deployment of underutilization ratios to justify safety net hospital closures and analysis of disparate impact jurisprudence in hospital closure cases. He is an editor of a forthcoming volume on structural racism in medical legal history. So let's welcome George here. George, yes, thank you. And George was not formally a student of Marcellus's, but they maintained an ongoing dialogue and conversation. Rebecca Powell, who was Marcellus's graduate student in the English department, graduated from Columbia College with a major in Spanish in 1999. She taught English and Spanish in public schools in Brooklyn from 2000 until 2013, when she returned to Columbia to pursue a PhD in English and comparative literature. She wrote her MA thesis about Langston Hughes, Hughes' translation of Lorca's poetry under the guidance of Marcellus Blount. She spent 2017 and 18 academic year in Madrid as a Fulbright scholar doing archival research for her dissertation about African American writers in Spain. So please join us in welcoming Rebecca. And Kendall Thomas is very modest in this little two-sentence biography that he's given us. Kendall was an early colleague of Marcellus's. You all came here around the same time, I think, right? Colleague of Marcellus's. He is the Nash Professor of Law and Director of the Center for the Study of Law and Culture at Columbia. He was a contributor to a classic text by Blount and George Cunningham, Representing Black Men. His areas of interest are human rights, legal philosophy, feminist legal theory, critical race theory, legal philosophy. Please join me in welcoming Kendall Thomas. So each presenter will present for about 15 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience before moving on to our next session. I think George is first, yes.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to thank Farah and Ellie once more for extending an invitation to me to speak in honor of Dr. Blount. So today I'd like to ask, what does it mean to inherit a library? Does it create obligations and bonds that must be honored? The Oxford English Dictionary defines inheritance as money, property, or a title received as an heir at the death of the previous holder, i.e. inherited wealth, or a quality, characteristic, or predisposition derived genetically from one's parents or ancestors, i.e. inherited diseases. The twin connotations of inheritance, the bequeathal of material and the genetic inheritance of a more abstract value, shape the subject of my talk today. I, along with many other faculty colleagues and graduate students, inherited pieces of Marcellus's library. Being the typically self-effacing man that he was, when I sought to separate what I had acquired from what I previously owned, I was frustrated by the lack of Marcellus's signature on the title page of each book, or the date he received a book, or where he read it. Instead, I had to pick books off my shelf by instinct and faulty memory, by probable thematic symmetry, and sometimes aided by the characteristic tuft of post-it notes that Marcellus used to annotate his books. How can we read meaning within a collection of books in a library and the intellectual trajectory it suggests? What happens when we merge into the stream of that intellectual trajectory after the books we inherit meld into our libraries? As tempted as I am to perform a semiotics of Marcellus's library, I know it would be unethical to do so without first explaining my own intellectual investments. I'll do so by stating common markers of personal and professional identity. I am a 30-something, Black, openly gay, first-generation scholar who is also a legal historian of the 20th century US, healthcare, public health, and the welfare state. There, I've said it, but I see nothing in these descriptors that sufficiently represent my multitudes or contradictions or even a supposed permanence of intellectual investment. In his 1988 review essay, Written by Ourselves, which argued against post-structuralist claims about so-called devious agendas and theories of representation, Marcellus wrote, "Whatever our given names, our professional identities are inscribed within a history of continuing struggle. Even so, I feel the deep pain that comes with the death of a beloved person and an interpretive chasm that must be crossed in the realm of life." As Marcellus so powerfully asked in that early essay, how can Afro-Americans operate within Euro-American political and economic institutions such as the Research University without forgetting or changing or losing the strength of their sustaining cultural heritage? I would suggest one way to do so is to build and curate a library. Still, what was once potential fodder for an active dialogue, a collection of books composed largely of underrepresented and actively oppressed voices, transforms into a means for excavation and supposition. Under this pursuit, research for the signs of proper representation do not end, but continue, perhaps endlessly. In light of the words that Marcellus left behind, I wonder whether he would have wanted it any other way. In a sense, by so often taking up space in the background, by working through the interstices of academic administration, and by putting energy into introducing anthologies like Representing Black Men, Marcellus demonstrated an ethic of honoring the voices of his colleagues, comrades, and intellectual children. In short, I suspect he would have wanted us to continue to do the hard work of analysis and creation that is inherent to meaning-making. It seems to me that a library does many things that stand independent of the act of analyzing signs and symbols, which are essential to self-fashioning identity as a bulwark against representation outside oneself. A library supplements humility, kindness, and empathy. One cannot be wise without knowing what's been said and what remains to be said. One, hopefully, becomes kinder in light of seeing the effort expended to create most books. And one develops deep empathy through reading other people's experiences. A library must be read, or not. And even in the affirmative or negative possibilities for its use, it always demands introspection and an examination of one's own intellectual and spiritual content. A library is multiple, composed both of stable objects that continuously move places on the shelf, in the room, or between people. The books I inherited were once part of Marcellus's library and still are imbued with that origin in my mind, yet they have merged with my pre-existing collection and, dare I say, recollection. When and if I share them with others, I suspect they will not hold this origin story in their mind. The book will accrue new relational qualities and values. In fact, in Marcellus's library, I re-encountered some titles that I had previously owned and given to friends or loaned from the college library. To see them again felt like a powerful echo, a strange sort of affirmation. A library is a humanist project, a signal of Marcellus's generous investments to others and his shared intellectual ties. A library is a site for declaration and subtle statements. A library is a way to plant a seed. As Alice McCrum reported in the Columbia Spectator, Marcellus gave 2 books of poetry to each of his graduate students at the end of the semester. Lastly, Marcellus's library, in particular, showed his investments in labor politics, his exploration of making sense of AIDS, his solidarity with students, his deeply expansive sense of gender, his love for theory, and for other anthologies, like Bruce Morrow's and Charles H. Howell's Shade, an anthology of fiction by Black gay men of African descent, E. Patrick Johnson's and Mae D. Henderson's Black Queer Studies, or Stephen G. Fullwood's and Charles Stevenson's Black Gay Genius, Answering Joseph Beam's Call. With these thoughts of the ethic of inheritance and practice of interacting with a library in mind, I divide this talk into 2 gerunds. First, let us think about how today we are honoring Marcellus's ethical life. Then, let us ponder how Marcellus's scholarship and forum building created a model wherein we consider crossing the epistemological chasm between emergent scholarship and new ways of reading. A natural place to begin, it seems to me, is with the path-breaking 1996 edited volume Representing Black Men, which Marcellus co-edited with George P. Cunningham. The book is a testament to space and courage, to bravery and holding down a vanguard of new questions, perspectives, and answers. These are the words that rushed into my mind as I read Marcellus's and George's generous introduction to the work of Representing Black Men's contributors. The love conveyed on these pages emerged despite a post-Moynihan, post-Reagan, neoliberal assault on the image and being of Black men, women, and even children. The words are written with a force of conviction at a time when the Clinton administration joined an intellectual lineage of their own that focused the discourse about welfare reform and criminality squarely on the backs of Black people. With Representing Black Men, to say the real Black men are here and queer and understood in their full humanity by women seems a deceptively simple declaration, even though in reality it was a Herculean feat to get those words printed by a major academic press. Why, as Marcellus and George write, was the nightmare of the collapse of patriarchy represented in blackface? How could that bad dream be written on the pages of the late Newsweek magazine by skinfolk? That Marcellus and George made institutional space to disrupt pernicious fictions about the realities of Black manhood is the first bestowal that I am fortunate to receive from Marcellus's library. The politics necessary to create conditions for scholarship, a balm created without apology for an injured community rather than as a moral appeal to white folks, is the first necessary condition for the production of emergent scholarship and the ethics necessary to read in new ways. It is not lost upon me that this abstract idea had to precede the instantiation of the material conditions to collect and preserve knowledge that was in the process of becoming prominent. The idea was an irrefutable corollary to the library I inherited. Marcellus's and George's invitation to pay attention to the multiplicity of Black maleness in dialogic exchange is a second necessary condition for the production of much of Marcellus's library. The books in Marcellus's library are vast, stretching decades before his birth and decades after the beginning of his career. Many, like Patricia Hill Collins's Black Sexual Politics, or Bell Hooks's We Real Cool, Black Men and Masculinity, or Robert F. Reed Farr's Black Gay Man essays, or Mark Anthony Neal's Looking for Leroy, Illegible Black Masculinities, were produced after Representing Black Men was published. Others, like Marcellus's extensive collection of Zora Neale Hurston novels, or James Baldwin's work, or even Michel de Montaigne's essays, preceded and constituted the root of his intellectual inheritance. The delight of this chronological view lies in the fact that the range of subjects that I see, and areas that were not squarely focused on the plight of Black men, form both the link and the canopy of the tree of knowledge that Marcellus's work sprouted from and helped to grow. In the elegant way that the Black experience reflects and illuminates the symmetries of life's hardships and joys across time and space, Marcellus's library points to the centrifugal force of seemingly tangential narratives. These links back and forward in time show how beauty can sometimes only be understood in the light of a setting sun. We are too blinded to see the connections that suffuse our work as we look at the sun rising. But at dusk, we have an opportunity to contemplate and rest. In this sense, the sunset of Marcellus's life and his collection of authorial interlocutors brings to mind the natural setting of the hush arbor, a place where enslaved persons would gather in secret to practice their religious traditions. An idea brought to life in the materiality of a wild bramble, the hush arbor both endangered the enslaved persons who flouted slave codes and engendered the continuity of culture and shared knowledge. There is beauty in the darkness too, just as there is danger. Yet, the hush arbor was one of the few spatial temporal moments free from the white gaze, colonial control, and near constant paranoia. Whether under the faint moonlight or besides the buzz of a neon light, how ironic is it that our multiplicities as Black men often shine most brightly in the dark? It seems that Marcellus understood this insight and protected it fiercely. On the one hand, the academic press is the most exposing and competitive place to form ideas. On the other hand, to create an edited volume so squarely geared toward expressing representation through the voices of the purported objects of public policy and liberal reform was to create a hush arbor for our own intellects. As Marcellus shared in an interview with Elizabeth Sarah Ross in the winter 2016 Institute for Research in African American Studies newsletter, he thought that the Are the Gods Afraid of Black Sexuality? Religion and the Burdens of Black Sexual Politics conference was liberating because it got scholars out of their institutional context of being the singular avatar of representation. Instead of being the only Black scholar to raise questions of queer subjects, for example, Marcellus said the conference unified many of these singular avatars into a communal forum. The conference, Marcellus thought, went to the heart of where the religious experience might be located now and the ways in which the church is a social institution. He continued, I would have to say that I emerged somewhat transformed, energized by the notion that the work I do is part of a collective enterprise. It was nice to see younger scholars engaged in that, but also to see how the work of intellectual inquiry might be married. To be at a conference where there are practitioners, theorists, it was just amazingly exciting and successful, and the model for the kind of conference that IRAAS should continue to do in the future, breaking down the boundaries between church and state, the boundaries between the activists and the scholars, and really coming together to think about what it is that we share as cultural workers and what languages we can share in thinking about the work that we do. In this quote, we hear all we need when it comes to Marcellus's honorable ethic. He honored others. He realized that we are always co-constitutive, always co-creating, whether in anthology or in monograph. In this quote, I see how his love for dance was really a metonym for the exchange of ideas and affect. What does Marcellus's library provide us? A space of refuge from ritual silencing, a pause to gather our thoughts and to be in conversation with interlocutors, both present, distant, and ancestral. In this way, Marcellus understood the power of the anthology or the conference to make heavy work a shared labor and thus ultimately lighter. While darkness remains and efforts continue to protect the conditions for the production of Black studies, queer studies, and other oppressed sites of knowledge, I imagine Marcellus's ethic, his quietude, yet spontaneous dynamism, his support in space-making, his kindness backed by fierceness are much akin to the tightly gripped hands in the holds of the slaver's ship or the energetic friction of the ballroom. These two different spaces, one of tragedy, the other life-affirming, are also linked. Out of the conditions of captivity come the surety of freedom. And yet, Marcellus and George, in representing Black men, understood the vexing position of the literary critic, constructing scholarly and activist identities, yet in doing so not knowing just who we are, nor why the complexity and diversity of African American men necessitates careful, theoretical, and political scrutiny. Sometimes to amend the ritual silencing of Black gay men, you just have to dance in the company of your own. Other times, you must be left alone to read a book. All too often, you have to choose between Audre Lorde's nostrum, "Your silence will not protect you," or a strategic muteness whenever institutional serendipity overwhelms you in a room filled with vociferous white people who might happen to make a living off of dissecting you, then representing you, and finally, once the terms and conditions have been set, cueing when you may speak. Representation matters, but it is often tiring. A library does not demand speech. A library allows you to shift the weight of the unresolved and the ineffable onto the sheer density of its yellowed pages. Book spines bleed into one, conclusions merge into introductions. A curatorial life, Imani Perry writes in Vexy Thing on Gender and Liberation, becomes a space for refuge from the demands of speaking or acting on behalf of someone or the state of being so depicted. It also offers a refusal of a pernicious canon. What a sublime density of thought we've created and are creating. How so far we have yet to go in steering the reins of our own representation. Considering the long effort to establish the African American and African Diaspora Studies Department here at Columbia University, an accomplishment we rightly and auspiciously celebrate this evening, I am struck by how Marcellus's spirit and the spirit of his, nay, our ancestors, continues to animate our efforts. It all begins with an idea, then action, and over time, this interplay often accretes into a library. Ideas to action, action to ideas. A shrine to thought that offers solace, yet eventually facilitates our own thinking, our own agency, our own representational response. The creation of a library and a professional identity are more closely linked than we might first assume. So now, we have achieved a new level of institutional representation, the replacement of older burdens for newer ones, yet the problem of the Afro-Americanist literary critic remains. Another word for inheritance is that of a rich burden. Some burdens ought to be cherished and protected. Some ought to be discarded. Choosing between the two is our ethical obligation, and the only way we can read ourselves anew.
I feel somewhat outclassed. But I should say, can people hear me? Is this, okay. That this is maybe the perfect transition because Marcellus sticking Post-it notes in his books. I do too, and I think I know why. Because we were both children of the New York City public schools where you give your books back at the end of the semester and you never, ever, ever write in them, ever. And I still can't do this. It drives me crazy. And I think all you private school people, so I suspect that the Post-it note thing is the mark of the public school student, which may lead perfectly into what I was going to talk about, which was Marcellus and James Baldwin and I as fellow New Yorkers. And I have to say, the first time I met Marcellus, he introduced himself as someone who had lived or was about to live in all 5 boroughs of New York City. And being a native New Yorker, I was very impressed because that's very unusual. And I am a lifelong Manhattan girl, but I had come out of 13 years of teaching in a couple different neighborhoods in Brooklyn. And I think Marcellus, better than anyone at Columbia, maybe understood what navigating those 2 worlds was like, and those 2 very different spaces, and the kind of whiplash that you got sometimes. And after he moved to his last apartment, we were neighbors in a little corner underneath Morningside Heights that used to be Harlem and that I still call Manhattan Valley because I refuse to surrender it completely to the forces of gentrification and property developers who now want to call it the Upper West Side. And part of my sentimental attachment to Manhattan Valley as a distinct neighborhood is because its identity recalls a kind of border zone, which was one of the few truly integrated areas in Manhattan. Marcellus, for example, lived around the corner from 106th Street, which is officially Duke Ellington Boulevard, named for a resident. On 110th Street, as some of you probably know, there's a plaque that commemorates the home of George Gershwin, where he composed Rhapsody in Blue. A couple of blocks south, at about 101st, 415 Central Park West, there is a plaque with a list of artists and musicians who all lived in the same building within a couple of years of each other, including Art Blakey, Yip Harburg, Max Roach, Lawrence Hart, Elvin Jones, the list goes on. Suspiciously large number of drummers, so I think 415 Central Park West must have very thick walls, but that's a separate issue. And so Marcellus spent the last years of his life in a neighborhood that resisted classification, which was very appropriate for someone who is from all 5 boroughs. And it was not quite Harlem proper, not quite the Upper West Side, very frequent presence of Spanish spoken on the streets, but not really dominated by any one ethnic group. So it was appropriate that I read James Baldwin's final novel, Just Above My Head, in a graduate seminar with Marcellus, because one of the things I've always loved about Baldwin is that he seems, to me at least, to be one of the very few writers who writes in New York I find absolutely recognizable. And Marcellus described Just Above My Head as the novel that Baldwin couldn't write earlier in his career because of its breadth and scope. And it's this wonderfully big, sprawling, messy novel which swings through the South, has sections in Paris, touches on London, on Abidjan, and through it all, like a touchstone, is New York City, which is a kind of home base for characters who think of themselves as homeless. I know that Marcellus wanted to write about Baldwin in Paris, but I doubt I could match his eloquence there, and I think other people will take up that torch. So I want to talk now about how New York shows up in Just Above My Head, and more specifically, the neighborhoods that both Marcellus and I knew and loved. Just Above My Head is a novel where geography generally is laden with symbolism. The South, which are the alabaster towns that the main characters travel through as both artists and activists, is a place of both terror and authenticity. And Farah actually has written about how the South is both life-threatening and life-giving in Baldwin's work, and how he was one of the first African-American writers who were children of immigrants to northern cities to explore the redemptive possibilities of the South, especially in his first novel, Go Tell It on the Mountain. Just Above My Head revisits a lot of the themes and the incidents of Go Tell It on the Mountain expanded, but with the benefit of 25 years of experience, the gulf of the civil rights movement, and the early work of Toni Morrison, contributing to the idea of the South as not just a site of terror and shame, but also the home of very necessary and nurturing roots. The South in Just Above My Head is an ancestral home in a work that also recognizes that for many people, home is nightmarish and unsafe. And the metaphorical opposite of the South in the novel is not the North, which is much more differentiated and specific, but rather, I would say, Paris, where one of the main characters, Arthur Montana, has a love affair with a wealthy Frenchman, which seems idyllic, possibly because it's too brief to become problematic. The description of Paris reflects a genuine love for the city, notwithstanding ironic flourishes Baldwin adds. He writes, Arthur has never seen the Champs-Élysées by night. It's best, of course, to see it for the first time at night, and if one can manage to be young, that helps. If in addition to being young, one can also arrange to see it for the first time at night with a lover, one cannot claim to be doing too badly. But if in addition to being young and seeing the Champs-Élysées for the first time at night with a lover, that lover happens furthermore to be French, one is in a rare and exalted category indeed. And Baldwin then goes on and admits that there's absolutely nothing to see on the Champs-Élysées, especially at night, but adds that it's all quite magical tonight. So where the South is both the site of danger and rootedness, Paris is associated with the giddy freedom and absolute irresponsibility of a tourist. And Pekka Kilpeläinen describes Paris as both a utopia and a heterotopia, which uses Foucault's terminology to describe Foucault's city. But in a novel dedicated to the dead weight of history and the meaning of homes and homecoming, New York City stubbornly resists being an allegory. Harlem is maybe the most mythologized New York neighborhood in Baldwin's work, and Herb Boyd's biography of Baldwin is built around the physical spaces of Harlem and how they influenced Baldwin's life and writings. And in her analysis of Another Country, Selenia suggests that Baldwin frames the New York City cityscape as a series of opposing spaces which function as metaphors for antonyms, contrasting ideals, and ideologies created by social and racial tensions that expand outside the marginalized Harlem into the white neighborhoods of New York. However, one of the pleasures of reading Just Above My Head is looking at how this neat dichotomy dissolves in the ambiguous and shifting border zones between New York's neighborhoods. Hall Montana, who's the brother of Arthur, one of the novel's principal narrators, declares the importance of border zones within New York at the very beginning of the novel as he starts the story and says, "We live on the edge of the Bronx, near Yonkers. Julia lives in Yonkers." And he proceeds to make a half-hour drive between two neighborhoods which are technically in different cities. It's the first but not the last time that Hall, whose very name suggests a space which is at once central to and connecting with other spaces, points to areas which defy facile definition as either marginal or central. Jenny James, who reads Just Above My Head through the lens of Glissant's Poetics of Relation, suggests that Baldwin imagines Black kinship as constituted from errant travels, both literal and metaphoric, which echo the wandering paths of Diaspora, a relational practice that crosses geographic, emotional, and spiritual distances. James's reading focuses on the continents discussed in the novel, Europe, North America, and Africa, but her insistence on nonlinear errantry seems to me to apply with equal force to the scenes laid within New York City and to push against the notion of a center and periphery of the city with fixed symbolic values. When Hall's narrative jumps backward in time to root itself in Harlem, the reader familiar with New York geography will notice that Harlem is, as it has always been, an ill-defined area, both in terms of geography and ethnicity. When Hall returns from the Korean War, he describes being driven home from a Hudson River pier in Midtown by his brother. It must have been a Sunday, Columbus Circle with banners on, balloons and horse-drawn carriages, Black women pushing baby carriages, young people draped around the base of one of the statues at the entrance to the park. And the park seemed to be full, although the air was brisk. Mourners on the benches, rigid, silent women, white, sometimes with a book, men still as cats and boys as lithe. We inched across the circle and picked up speed. The houses began to change. "This place is becoming really Spanish," I said. "Naturally," said Peanut, "this place was a Spanish queen's idea." "Watch your language," Arthur said, and we laughed, and I was suddenly, in spite of everything, happy to be back home. We reached our block and began rolling towards the house. It's no secret to anyone familiar with West Side Story that the Upper West Side in the 1950s was becoming really Spanish, as indeed was East Harlem, where Baldwin himself had grown up. But it's interesting that in a passage with extremely detailed geographical descriptions, Baldwin's narrator makes no mention of going north of Central Park, though a car that inches across Columbus Circle enough to give a view of strollers in the park is presumably heading toward 8th Avenue. Readers may either assume that the West Side, and Columbia, if the Montanas are driving up Broadway, just flashes by as the car picks up speed, or they may stop to wonder whether the place that Hall identifies as our block is in fact in the neighborhood he's already identified as really Spanish. Herb Boyd's biography of Baldwin notes that when Baldwin first left Harlem in the mid-40s, he still found it necessary to maintain some sort of connection to the community through Mickle's Bar, which was located on Columbus at 97th Street, and may have been like a DMZ location, not exactly in Harlem, but close enough for him to rendezvous with his friends from both sides of this presumed borderline. Harlem here flows around and easily envelops Central Park until somewhere around the 96th Street subway station on both sides of the park, which those of you who've been in New York long enough will testify is true. But while Hall specifies that the houses change as they travel northward, he doesn't comment on the nature of the change. And even in today's environment of multi-million-dollar co-ops, anyone heading north from Columbus Circle will notice a decrease in midtown high-rises and appearance of brownstones. So this may be an aesthetic as much as an economic or ethnic change that he's commenting on. Hall's homecoming involves a recognizable neighborhood, but not one that fits into neat geographic, economic, or racial categories, and certainly not one that draws a neat distinction between central and peripheral. The neighborhood itself is a kind of border zone. Indeed, Peanuts' joke that this place was a Spanish queen's idea and Arthur's pun on the word queen further destabilized the notion that Hall's home neighborhood can be easily identified as a site of freedom or oppression. On one level, the emphasis on the Spanishness of the neighborhood gives the lie to the mythology of Harlem, which portrays it as a dominantly or exclusively African-American space, by pointing out the multiplicity of ethnic identities available to Harlem residents. On a second level, which may be especially important and just above my head, which grapples at length with what Marcellus called the queer family, the bitter association of the word queen with both imperial conquest and homosexuality unsettles the simple idea that normative sexuality is invariably hegemonic, and by extension that queer sexualities must invariably side with the oppressed. Any attempt to pin a definite symbolism to the neighborhood, which may or may not be part of Harlem, and may or may not be primarily African American, and may or may not be linked to queerness, dissolves in the same kind of contradictions that Hall notices in his description of Columbus Circle, where the men are as still as cats and the boys as lithe as cats. Hall retraces his steps in reverse near the end of the novel when once again on a bright, cold Sunday, he walked down West End Avenue wearing a black Russian fur hat and turned east on 59th Street, walking those long blocks to Columbus Circle, which was filled with New York's Sunday innocents, crossed the circle and continued down to 57th Street, turning east again to Carnegie Hall. The walk down West End Avenue, which ends at 106th Street, and then as now was self-consciously wealthy and genteel, once again points to how much Harlem is both a flexible and a permeable neighborhood. Once again, Columbus Circle seems to mark a far more distinct geographical boundary between residential and commercial than any demarcation of Harlem. But since the Sunday innocence of Columbus Circle is contrasted only with the dignity of West End Avenue, it's once again difficult to schematize any of the neighborhoods as representing the hegemonic versus the marginal. Midtown is physically central, but doesn't seem to have tremendous hegemonic weight. Hall's black Russian fur hat seems like a portent of things to come, since once he reaches Carnegie Hall, he goes to lunch at the Russian tea room with his ex-lover, Julia. And the black fur hat seems like a compliment to the tea room, famously founded by white as opposed to red Russians. Indeed, the tea room becomes a space where black and white New Yorkers interact as Hall watches white families enter the tea room and thinks that it was nice to watch them in a setting in which we didn't seem to menace each other. They also glanced casually at Julia and me, seeming to feel a similar ease and relief. This moment of watching without menace mirrors a slightly earlier scene where Hall's brother Arthur watches and is watched in a cafe on the Boulevard Saint-Germain in Paris. However, it's impossible to set up a simple contrast between Hall's experience in the Russian tea room and Arthur's in the Chez Lippe. For one thing, both involve moments of fleeting peace in a multiracial setting. For another, while Arthur recognizes a mixture of Americans and other foreigners in Paris, Hall watches the American families entering the Russian tea room and thinks that they all seemed vaguely like refugees. Most of them were refugees or had so begun their lives in America. In one way, they were certainly more at home in America than Julia or I could claim to be, yet in another way, a way that Julia and I were not, they were homeless. Hall goes on to focus his observations on a grandmother, a delicately boned lady with auburn and silver hair cut short, extremely beautiful when young, with that kind of fragile, breathless, wide-eyed beauty one associates for some reason with Vienna, and imagines the lady in her youth, let us say in Vienna, marked for death, arriving naked at Golgotha. Hall's imagined history of the grandmother he sees at the Russian tea room deconstructs the notion that New York, or even the United States, is a uniquely dangerous or violent location, and delicately recalls the hints of violence surrounding the North Africans in Paris that Arthur ignores. Paris, and by extension Europe, may be a heterotopia if one accepts that heterotopias are by definition temporary and transient spaces. But by this definition, the Russian tea room, with its European name and clientele, an unquestionably central geographical location in New York, is also a heterotopia, where both Hall and Julia and the nameless refugees surrounding them can for a moment watch and be watched without menace. Baldwin himself acknowledged that his portrayal of New York was too polysemic to be neatly categorized, in an ironic aside which perhaps serves as the best commentary on his descriptions of the city, and perhaps the reasons why he was unable to flatten his description to a single key. No other city is so spitefully incoherent. Whereas other cities flaunt their history, their presumed glory, such history as New York has been unable to entirely obliterate is to be found mainly in the backwaters of Wall Street, in and around Washington Square, and for the relentless searcher in the grimly inaccessible regions of the Bronx. No plaque indicates that Harlem was once a Dutch province with 2 A's to its name, or that the movie house on 42nd Street, the New Amsterdam, bears the name the city was given when, again by means of the Dutch, it entered recorded or acceptable history. The name of the island, an Indian name, Manhattan, was never changed. The conquerors had overlooked something. I always like to think that the spirit of the violated land had whispered, "Thus far, but no farther." Manhattan, the island on which the city rests, is stronger than New York. Like many of his generation, Baldwin believed in links between land, people, and history. Diaspora, immigration, and the condition of being a refugee were thus experiences of irreparable loss. New York, the way station of immigrants and refugees, which has spitefully obliterated its history, is incapable of being a stable signifier like Paris or the South. Instead, for the children of internal immigrants and refugees like Hall and Arthur Montana, and also for the children of immigrants and refugees from all corners of the world, New York's major characteristic remains that it's a recent and undiscovered present, divorced from a frequently traumatic past. As Arthur Montana tells his French lover, "I've never made up my mind if I love New York. That's very complicated, but Lord, I know I can hate it." I would argue that James Baldwin shares this intense but ambivalent relationship with the city of shifting and unstable meaning and physical presence, not only with his characters, but with other writers who've captured the city with equal clarity, and with many New Yorkers, including Marcellus and me, who read his work with affection because we recognize an equally reluctant and annoyed compatriot. Thank you.
Is it all right if I close this, or will we lose our image? Do you know?
It's still there.
It's still there. Oh, sorry. Yeah. program states that I'd be offering some notes on representing black men. The 1996 volume of essays that Marcellus and George C. Cunningham co-edited. Although I will say something about black manhood and masculinities and the question of representation, I want to do so by offering some fragments, and they truly are fragments, toward a reading of two other texts. So I hope you will receive this not so much as a formal paper, but as a brief informal seminar in the spirit of Marcellus's own pedagogical practice. The first of the two texts is Marcellus's short, stunning 2007 essay in the African American Review, Paul Laurence Dunbar and the African American Elegy. The second is a project, an uncompleted project, entitled Listening for My Name, Black Men and the Politics of Friendship. So I want to frame these thoughts about manhood around a consideration of mourning and mortality and their memory. A few years ago, I was walking down Christopher Street here in Manhattan, and somehow and very suddenly, I could see, or not so much see as sense, the presence of ghosts all around me. And the memory that rushed in of all the people I had known and loved as a young man, this was just a few years ago, all the people I had known and loved as a young man who had died brought me back, as it often did in the early years of the epidemic, to my closest black gay male friends at Yale, all of whom died before the age of 35. Marcellus was one of the people I met in this coterie of black gay men in my 20s in New Haven when I was a student at Yale Law School and he was a graduate student. I joined the faculty here at Columbia in 1984, the year before Marcellus did. And since his death, the renewed sense of loss that I experienced in the Village a few years ago has followed me uptown. Morningside Heights has become a matrix of mourning. Some of that has, I suppose, to do with an awareness of my own mortality, reaching 60 a couple of years ago, and also marking the beginning of my 15th year as a seronegative black gay man living with cancer. Marcellus, as you all know, was a long-term survivor of HIV/AIDS. We haven't really known what to make of the deaths, the recent deaths, of those men who have lived into their 40s and 50s. The men who are brothers and sisters, actually, not just men, but our brothers and sisters who survived long enough to receive highly active antiretroviral therapy, which became available in 1995. But it seems to me, or at least seems to me, in this room, at this moment where I'm standing, that memory comes to mean, or rather comes to mean differently as one gets older, particularly if one is facing a life-threatening illness. The body fails you, you age before your healthy friends age, you experience alienation from and aversion even to your own physical embodied presence in a way that's hard to explain to healthy people who are your age. And I imagine that this experience was the stuff of which Marcellus's experience here at Columbia consisted in large part. He was unlike me, a very private person, and we spoke about our personal lives fairly infrequently, but we did have those conversations, and we shared this period of being young men in New Haven together. As I said earlier, in the early 80s, when we would take time from the library and our work to gather at the one gay club, Partners, whose small dance floor became, on the weeknights especially, a space of sweaty bodies in motion, and gave us a moment to quite literally lose our minds to the beat of Grace Jones' Pull Up to the Bumper, and Loose Joints, Is It All Over My Face? You Got Me Love Dancing. But this was a time of joy and terror because we were living in the shadow of the epidemic. In the early years, we didn't know what the agent that transmitted what was then called GRID, gay-related immunodeficiency syndrome, was. And we were all told to assume that we were infected with whatever it was. So we lived in the shadow of mortality as young men. And I want to suggest, because Marcellus is dead, that this shadow of mortality was a preoccupation in his own work, and particularly in this essay that I want to talk about on Paul Laurence Dunbar, the great African-American poet. Marcellus's project and preoccupation in the Dunbar essay are, quote, the tensions between individual and collective loss, in Dunbar's elegant 1895 poem, Frederick Douglass, which was published in the year of Douglass's death. Marcellus's focus is on the ways in which, quote, the individual utterance might illustrate communal values, or as he puts it elsewhere, how the individual comes to stand for a specific community in Dunbar's elegiac poem to the memory of Frederick Douglass. Marcellus argues specifically in this essay, which is short, I brought some copies for those of you who would like to read it, that Dunbar, quote, initiates a tradition of African-American elegy. The case that Marcellus makes for Dunbar as a black Theocritus, Theocritus was a 3rd century BC elegist, is centered around the ways in which Dunbar's practice, unlike the classical practice of elegiac poetry writing, was not focused on an individual, notwithstanding the name of the poem, Frederick Douglass, but it was focused on a group, African Americans, at a time which Marcellus says, quote, marks a bleak moment in black history. So Dunbar's spacious, gracious elegy, as Marcellus describes it, looks back at Douglass's life, his life as a slave and his life as a freedman, and locates in slavery, in the passage from enslavement to freedom, a specific historical institution, but more generally, a metaphor for historical oppression. For Marcellus, the form of the elegy itself, as he writes, operates as a strategy of reading. I would say that we might go further and say that Marcellus suggests that elegy is not merely a strategy, but can be seen in Dunbar's poem to be an allegory of reading as such, of reading specifically race, which Marcellus describes, quote, as the basic grammar of identity, and as an allegory of historical experience. In the language of Robert Hayden's description of the middle passage that Marcellus quotes in his essay on Dunbar, race is an allegory of the specific historical experience of, and this is Hayden, voyage through death to life upon these shores. A life after death, which is, by virtue of that temporal reversal, a life in America, haunted by death, a life, to borrow a phrase that my late teacher, Robert Cover, used to characterize legal interpretation, a life which unfolds in a field of pain and death. So Marcellus is drawn to Dunbar's poetry and its narration of the historical experience of African people in the Americas as an irreducibly elegiac experience. As he puts it, quote, "The act of elegiac mourning reaffirms the connections among African Americans." So elegy as community constitutive. So the elegiac poem becomes, on Marcellus's reading, a metonym, quote, for the unstable identities of Blacks in the post-Reconstruction era. Now, where I want to go with this is to argue that Marcellus's critical meditation on the African-American elegiac tradition, initiated by Dunbar, becomes a metonym of gay Black identities in the age of AIDS. Right? He's writing in 2006-07 about a poem that Dunbar wrote in 1895, but his argument about the continuities among the practitioners, the African-American practitioners of elegy from Dunbar to Hayden, is, I think, a feature of his own critical practice. So Marcellus says that the distinctive and characteristic practices, I'm quoting him, that we see at work in elegy are practices of the tradition of African-American elegy, which turn, quote, on asserting the poet's relation to living communities. I think here of long-term survivors, people like Marcellus, who lived with HIV for a long time, who maintained a connection with living communities in the face of death, much longer than those of our younger colleagues who died young. But notice this insistence in Marcellus on individual poetic utterances illustrating being connected to communal values. He writes at one point in the essay about Dunbar's poem to Douglas, the individual comes to stand for a specific community. Marcellus happily lived long enough to become a gay Black elder. He died at 58, I believe, the same age, as it happens, as my late colleague, Kellis Parker, who was the first African-American to hold a seat on the law faculty here. Marcellus goes on to say that the Black elegiac tradition and its meditations on the dead, I'm quoting him, enact an emotional and ideological relationship to the living. Right? So the elegy tradition takes as its subject those who are dead through addressing and actually incorporating, inserting, placing, he writes at one point, the living in the poem through imaginative acts of poetic practice, so that, in Marcellus's words, the individual life comes to stand for the American experience, which in turn represents a sense of an African past. So this strategy of Dunbar's elegiac project, practicing poetry as achieved community, is the heart of Marcellus's essay. But he focuses in specifically on the mediating connection between individual and community, the race, of literary friendship and the practice of literary friendship by later Black male poets using the elegy form, centered around these practices of reflections of mourning and memory. And I want to suggest that these poetic practices, which are addressed to and include the living, but which nonetheless take place in the valley of the shadow of death, can be understood as a metaphor of Marcellus's intellectual practice here. He arrived, as I said earlier, at Columbia in the early years of the epidemic. I don't know if Marcellus had already seroconverted, but like any sexually active gay man in the 1980s, Marcellus may well have assumed, as we all did, and as I noted earlier, as we were all told to do, that he was already infected. So what explains this attraction to elegy? Marcellus writes at one point in the essay that for Dunbar, elegy is a poetic genre in which Dunbar was able to meditate in verse on, quote, what it means for him to write poetry, unquote. So I want to suggest that the short essay form in which Marcellus excelled was a medium in which he was able to reflect at one remove on what it meant for him to write critically about poetry, and critically in this essay about a particular genre, a Black literary practice and a study of a Black literary practice that takes place in the shadow of death, the shadow in which he lived most of his adult life, but which is not just about sorrow, because this dimension of community, Marcellus notes, is one in which we must see elegy as, quote, a space for mutual sustenance, a space for mutual sustenance. Now, writing is a solitary business, as any of you in this room who writes will know, and that is so even if we're mindful of the maxim of the late sociologist Alvin Gouldner, who wrote that the individuality of theory work is in part a socially sanctioned illusion. All theory is not merely influenced but produced by a group. As I said earlier, Marcellus notes that, quote, one of the important functions of elegy for Black poets is that it allows them to place their audience in their poetry. But it also allows them to address an audience that cannot be put in the poetry in any way except imaginatively, those who are dead. So Marcellus insists at one moment that Dunbar writes the poem Douglas for Frederick Douglass. He is also writing to Frederick Douglass. So he is addressing and conversing poetically, as often happens in elegy, with the dead man in the name of the race. And he names, Dunbar names Douglass as an important part of this mode of address. Let's turn then to the question of listening for my name. Marcellus begins the final paragraphs of the essay by turning from Dunbar's work to poems that, quote, other Black male poets write about him, Douglass. Marcellus mentions specifically and treats Robert Hayden and Michael S. Harper. But I would like to think that when Marcellus wrote these lines, indeed, when he wrote the entire essay, he was mindful of a still emerging tradition within Black elegiac poetry. I'm thinking here of the elegiac practice of Black gay male poets writing in response to and in the age of AIDS. This was a poetic labor of mourning and militancy, to borrow a phrase from the preface to Representing Black Men that Blount and Cunningham borrowed from Douglas Crimp to describe my essay in that volume. One of its most powerful examples is the poem When My Brother Fell for Joseph Beam, written by Essex Hemphill, whom we lost to HIV infection just a few months before Representing Black Men was published. Marcellus ends the essay with the discussion of two poems by Michael S. Harper. Harper, he notes, is so invested in the elegy as a literary form that he, Harper, quote, undertakes the task of renaming the genre, unquote, through his poetic performance of African-American literary tradition. Now, the careful reader of Blount's text cannot miss the way this account of Harper's artistic practice as a claim to a performative space operates simultaneously as a site for Blount's own queer Black turn at the end of this essay. Marcellus choreographs this queer Black aesthetic movement through a citation and recitation of Harper's poem, Paul Laurence Dunbar, 1872-1906, that is also a reworking of the famous Duboisian image of double consciousness. This is Harper. minstrel and mask, a landscape of speech and body burned in verbal space, the match cinder unstandard, double conscious brother in the veil, double conscious brother in the veil, double conscious brother in the veil, double conscious brother in the veil. Marcellus's queering, if you will, his unstandarding of the African American literary tradition unfolds in the space between this poem and the lines of another Harper poem he has just discussed in the essay entitled Corrected View, from which he quotes the following line: "Our mode is our jam session of tradition, past in this present moment articulated, an unreaching, extended, improvised love of past masters." Earlier in the essay, Marcellus observes that the new name Harper gives to the elegy is, quote, the African American praise poem, unquote. Marcellus then encrypts what I think is the critical theoretical heart of the essay in what takes the form of a casual, almost non-committal observation. He writes, elegy, praise poem, jam session, perhaps all of these will do, unquote. But running through and alongside this propositional claim is a rhetorical argument toward which Marcellus gestures in the idea image, in the quotation from Harper, of the jam session, of that aspect of the jam session as an image of the Black literary tradition. And he also gestures toward this idea in his reference to the poetic ambition to achieve the beloved community. I'm emphasizing here the focus on love. Although Blount does not fully develop, the question of love seems to me to connect all three of the aesthetic forms Blount designates as spaces for the invention and reinvention of notions of tradition. So I want to talk a little bit about this question of love and then sit down. I had missed this until last night around midnight when Marcellus came to me in the spirit, not in his own name, but in another's. Let me explain what I mean by turning to the Uncompleted Project, Listening for My Name, The Politics of Black Male Friendship. The line is from an old gospel song, "When he calls me, I will answer," or another name for the song, "I'll be somewhere listening for my name." I knew this song from my early childhood when I was a young gay boy and the musician and pianist, which a lot of young gay boys are, at the Ora Vista Missionary Baptist Church in Oroville, California. The song, variously attributed to Eduardo J. Longo or the great gospel composer Professor Theodore R. Fry, was a song that when I was a child we sang rarely, and as I recall, almost always only at funerals. In fact, my grandmother's no longer here, but I would have asked her because I don't ever remember singing this song anywhere else. Last night, I was trying to find out more about the song when I came across the following lines attributed to Melvin Dixon, the poet and novelist to whom Marcellus and George co-dedicated Representing Black Men. These are lines from Dixon's 1992 outright keynote address that was published in Callaloo as "I'll be somewhere listening for my name." This is Dixon. "As gay men and lesbians, we are the sexual niggers of our society. I come to you bearing witness to a broken spirit. I come to you bearing witness to a broken body, but a witness to an unbroken spirit. As for me, I may not be well enough or alive next year to attend the Lesbian and Gay Writers Conference, but I'll be listening somewhere for my name. If I don't make it to the tea dance or in the Pines, I'll be somewhere listening for my name. You then are charged by the possibility of your good health, by the broadness of your vision to remember." Melvin Dixon gave this speech in 1992, and he died on October 26, 1992, at the age of 42. Now, the point I want to make is that Marcellus's essay is itself an instance of the renaming that he identifies as central to Harper's poetic engagement with elegiac form. Marcellus concludes the Dunbar essay with the contention that, quote, "what I would call the African American elegy depends on the work of literary interpretation, unquote. Returning to Du Bois' figure of double consciousness, which he has just used Harper's Dunbar poem to introduce, Marcellus suggests that Harper views Dunbar as, quote, a literary relative of Du Bois, unquote. With a citation to Melvin Dixon's essay, the title of Marcellus's uncompleted project establishes the relational character, again, of Black literary study and the ways in which the vocation of Black literary criticism and theory, as I noted earlier, using Alvin Gouldner, is not merely influenced by, but produced by a group. So what is true of the elegiac poem is true of the critics writing about the elegiac poem, and more generally, about the critic's intellectual practice. That's my first point. My second and related point is that the artist and the critic's emotional and ideological relationship to the group is thus not only or simply about interpretation, but about representation, in the sense in which the late Stewart Hall famously defined the term as, quote, the active work of making things mean, unquote. The work of meaning-making undertaken by elegy, and I would suggest by Marcellus Blount's critical work on Dunbar, Harper, and Robert Hayden, is the active work of enacting or representing community, of making community mean in a way that is distinctive to the aesthetics of the African American literary tradition. I want to end by suggesting that Blount's preoccupation in the essay with renaming, and in the uncompleted project with the active work of listening for his name, is about his love, not just for the ghosts of the poets he studies, but for the gay Black men, living and dead, with whom he and his work were in conversation. What is more, that work reworks Du Boisian double consciousness, two souls, Negro and American, to rename it as Black and gay. I have to think that Marcellus almost certainly had Dixon's speech in mind, particularly his argument that as white gays deny multiculturalism among gays, so too do Black communities deny multisexualism among their members. Against this double cremation, we must leave the legacy of our writing. Our voice is our weapon. In taking Dixon's title as his own, Blount transposes the song Listening for My Name into another key and makes this gospel song a love song. It should be remarked that the renaming of Listening for My Name that Marcellus achieves through the title of his project is one that is made easier by the ambiguity of the song's lyrics. Unlike most spirituals and gospel songs, the he to whose call the song refers is never given a specific proper name. The line is, when he calls me, I will answer. I'll be somewhere listening for my name. There could then be an erotic undercurrent to the song. I'm reminded, I'll leave this out, I'm reminded of Marcuse's insistence in closing many years ago that, quote, the restoration of remembrance to its rightful place is one of the noblest tasks of thought. What, I wonder, would Marcellus have us remember? One thing I'm sure he would want us to remember here today is that the AIDS epidemic is not over. He'd want us to remember that 1 in 2 Black men, gay men nationally, will be diagnosed with HIV in their lifetime. He would want us to remember that more than 56% of Black trans women are HIV positive. He would want us to remember that although we account for only 13% of the population, we represent nearly half of all new HIV infections. As Stephen Thrasher noted in an article for the last World AIDS Day, because Americans imagine men who have sex with men to be white, Black gay and bisexual men are rendered invisible in our national zeitgeist, even as they live and die under conditions of existential suffering. I believe finally that in his recognition that race often stands not for individual identity, but for community, Marcellus would also want us to remember and never forget that wherever he is not listening just for his own name. He's listening in ethical communion with and for other names, the name of Melvin, of Asado, and Audrey, and Essex, and Joseph, to whom Essex dedicated his heart-wrenching elegy, When My Brother Fell for Joseph Beam, When my brother fell, I picked up his weapons and never once questioned whether I could carry the weight and grief, the responsibility he shouldered. I never questioned whether I could aim or be as precise as he. He had fallen, and the passing ceremonies marking his death did not stop the war. Our loss is greater than all the space we fill with prayers and praise. He burned out his pure life force to bring us a chance to love ourselves. Marcellus's critical practice was, for me, of Black literary study and a reconception of the critic as friend, and of the life of reading and writing about Black poetry and the African literary tradition as a practice of friendship, as an act of love, as a love song. When he calls me, I will answer. When he calls me, I will answer. When he calls me, I will answer. I'll be somewhere listening for my name. If I love right, I will answer. If I love right, I will answer. If I love right, I will answer. I'll be somewhere listening for my name. Oh, I'll be somewhere listening. I'll be somewhere listening. I'll be somewhere listening for my name. Oh, I'll be somewhere listening. I'll be somewhere listening. I'll be somewhere listening for my name.
So that will be the last word, closing this beautiful panel of papers engaging Marcellus's ideas and his person and all that he bequeathed us, from Baldwin to his library, as younger generations engage his inheritance, and that beautiful, beautiful ending from Kendall, reminding us of the work yet to be done and what Marcellus would not have us forget is our responsibility in the world. Thank you. Mm-hmm.